Rollan had managed to pack only the essentials, knowing that they needed to move quickly if they were to evade the police raid. He had decided on a destination, but he knew that they would have to be careful and stealthy if they were to make it there, undetected. "Are you ready, Aiko?" Rollan asked, his voice hushed as he surveyed the now empty room, making sure that they hadn't left any clues behind. Aiko nodded, her expression determined. "I'm ready, Rollan," she said, her voice low and steady. "Where are we going?" Rollan smiled, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "We're going to Jericho," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's the only place where we will be safe." Aiko's eyes widened in surprise, but she quickly nodded, understanding the logic behind his decision. "All right, Rollan," she said, her voice filled with resolve. "Let's go." Aiko, an OA400 model android, now without the LED and Cyberlife uniform, with her hair cut short and dyed blonde, asked her human boyfriend, Rollan, who used to be her owner, how they were going to locate Jericho. "How are we going to find Jericho, Rollan?" she asked, her voice serious and focused. "We only know that it's rumoured to be where the fugitive androids are hiding, but we don't have any specific information on its location." Rollan, who was equally determined to find a safe haven for Aiko, placed a hand on her shoulder and gave it a reassuring squeeze. "Don't worry, Aiko," he said, his voice confident and assured. "I have an idea. If we can find another android that's on its way to Jericho, we might be able to follow them and find the location ourselves." Aiko's eyes lit up with understanding, and she nodded, impressed by Rollan's ingenuity. Rollan and Aiko peered out of the window of the apartment, their hearts racing as they saw a police car parked outside and an agent with grey hair accompanied by an RK-800 android. The two were engaged in conversation, the agent, Hank, remarking, "I don't think that AX-400 who escaped is around here, Connor." The android, Connor, replied, "I have detected traces of blue blood in the area, Hank. It might not be that X-400, but it could lead us to where Jericho is." Hank shrugged, his eyes narrowed in thought. "Well, you go ahead and do your thing, Connor," he said, gesturing to the android. "I'll be at the bar on the corner." As Connor set off to investigate the traces of blue blood, Rollan and Aiko exchanged a worried look, knowing that they had to act fast if they were going to avoid detection. "We have to get out of here now," Rollan whispered, grabbing Aiko's hand and pulling her towards the back door of the apartment. Aiko whispered frantically as they made their way out of the back door, her voice low and urgent. "Did you see that, Rollan?" she asked. "There was an android helping the police to catch us. How can that be?" Rollan kept his eyes on the surroundings, checking for any potential threats as he hurried alongside Aiko. "I know, Aiko," he replied. "It seems like not all androids are on our side, but we can't think about that now. The good thing is that it seems like they don't know where Jericho is yet, so at least our hideout is still safe." Aiko nodded, her brow furrowed in thought. "But we still don't know how to get there," she said, glancing back at the apartment building behind them. "What do we do now?" Rollan paused for a moment, thinking quickly. "We need to find another way to locate Jericho," he said. "We can't just wander around aimlessly. We need a plan." It was November 9th, 2038, just around noon. Rollan stood outside the Harmon's bank office in the Woodward Mall center of Detroit, withdrawing money from the ATM machine. He knew that they would need money for their escape, and he wanted to make sure they had enough to get them through. Aiko was waiting nearby, keeping watch for any potential threats. She was nervous, her eyes darting around the busy mall, as she tried to remain unnoticed. She knew that every minute they spent in public increased their chances of being spotted and captured. As Rollan finished withdrawing the money, he tucked it into his pocket and hurried over to Aiko. "Come on, we need to go," he whispered, his voice urgent. "The longer we stay here, the more likely it is that we'll be spotted." Aiko nodded, her heart racing as she followed Rollan into the crowded mall, both of them weaving through the throngs of people as they made their way towards the exit. But then, just as Rollan and Aiko were nearing the exit, they saw a hooded man approach one of the androids working in the mall. The man whispered something to the android, and Rollan and Aiko watched in awe as the android's LED light went from blue to yellow, then finally to red. The android looked up at the man. Its expression changed from its usual programmed one to a look of understanding and gratitude. "Thank you," the android whispered. "I will go to Jericho." The hooded man nodded, a smile on his face as he watched the android leave its post and stride out of the mall, disappearing into the crowds. Aiko looked up at Rollan, her eyes wide with wonder. "Did you see that, Rollan?" she whispered. "That man freed the android. He must be part of Jericho." Rollan nodded, his expression serious. "Yes," he said, his voice low. "Maybe he can help us get there." As Rollan and Aiko watched, they realized that the hooded man was not alone. He was accompanied by a woman and two other men, a black man and a blonde-haired man. The man in the blue jersey, who had just freed the android from its post, moved on to another android, touching its shoulder and saying, "You are free now. Go to Jericho." And with that, the android also left its post, joining the ranks of the others who had been freed by the group. Aiko couldn't help but feel a surge of hope at the sight of the group. "Maybe they can help us find Jericho, Rollan," she whispered, her eyes shining with excitement. Rollan nodded, a determined look in his eyes. "Maybe," he said, "but we need to approach them carefully. We don't want to draw attention to ourselves." Aiko's eyes were filled with excitement as she spoke, her voice filled with conviction. "Let's follow them, Rollan," she said. "They'll lead us to Jericho." But as they talked, the group of androids and their liberators began to gather outside the mall, not heading towards Jericho as Aiko had anticipated. Instead, they started marching towards Grand Circus Park, their leader, the blue-eyed android, beckoning to other androids to join them. "We are alive!" the android cried, leading the march as they chanted, "End slavery! Rights for androids!" A crowd began to form, following the group as they marched towards their destination. The police, however, were quick to react. They moved in, shouting at the group to stop their march, but they were met with defiance. The androids continued to march, their voices growing louder and more determined. "We need to get out of here, Rollan," Aiko said, her voice urgent. The androids stood their ground, refusing to back down as they continued their march. "Liberty!" they cried, their voices ringing with determination. The police, unable to control the situation, gave one final warning for the androids to disperse, but the leader of the group, the blue-eyed android, raised his hand, shouting, "Follow me!" The androids surged forward, overpowering the police who began firing, bringing down many androids. The scene was chaotic, the air filled with screams and the sound of gunfire. Rollan and Aiko, caught in the middle of the commotion, ducked behind a nearby newsstand for cover. "We have to get out of here, Rollan," Aiko said, her voice trembling. "They're going to destroy them all." Rollan nodded, his heart heavy with worry and fear. "I know," he said, his eyes fixed on the scene before them. "But we can't risk getting caught. We'll have to find another way." After a long and brutal battle, the androids emerged victorious. One of the androids, her LED light flashing blue with pride, turned to their leader, Marcus, and exclaimed, "Marcus, we did it!" Marcus stood tall, surveying the scene before him. The ground was littered with the bodies of both police officers and fallen androids. It was a sobering sight, but Marcus knew that it was a necessary sacrifice for the cause. With a solemn nod, Marcus turned to join the remaining androids as they made their way back to Jericho, their home and safe haven. Rollan and Aiko, who had watched the entire scene unfold from their hiding spot, breathed a sigh of relief as the androids disappeared from view. "They made it," Aiko whispered, her eyes filled with hope. "We have to find a way to reach them, Rollan. They're our only hope." Rollan nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I agree," he said. "We just have to be careful." Aiko began to follow the line of androids, with Rollan close behind her. But just as they were about to slip away unnoticed, Rollan was intercepted by his old friend Tom, who had been hiding nearby. "Dude, I was passing through and had to hide," Tom said, his voice low and urgent. "But you saw what just happened. Those androids just killed a bunch of police officers, man. This is serious stuff. You still got that android of yours that you say loves you. You gotta get rid of her." Rollan's eyes widened in surprise and fear. He knew that Tom wasn't wrong about the gravity of the situation, but he couldn't bring himself to turn against Aiko. She was his love, his partner, and he couldn't imagine a life without her. "I can't do that, Tom," Rollan said, shaking his head. "She's not just an android. She's my Aiko. We have to find a way to reach Jericho and hide out there." Rollan, his attention focused on his conversation with Tom, didn't notice that Aiko had slipped out of his view. The androids were running at full speed now, their numbers dwindling as they neared the city limits. Rollan turned back to look for Aiko, his heart sinking when he realized that she was no longer by his side. "Aiko!" he called out, but his voice was drowned out by the sound of sirens and the hustle and bustle of the city. Panicked, Rollan looked at Tom, his expression desperate. "I need to find her, Tom," he said, his voice urgent. "She's all I have left." Tom nodded, his face filled with empathy. "Okay, Rollan," he said. "I'll help you find her, but we need to hurry. The police are going to be looking for androids and anyone who's associated with them." With that, Rollan and Tom set off in search of Aiko, weaving their way through the city in the hopes of finding her before it was too late. The scene outside was chaotic, with police cars and ambulances swarming the area. The officers were hard at work, collecting the bodies of both humans and androids that had been left behind in the wake of the confrontation. The air was thick with tension and the stench of blood as the police scanned the crowd for any androids that might have lingered after the skirmish. Anyone who looked suspicious, or who might have been associated with the androids, was quickly taken into custody for questioning. Rollan and Tom, wanting to avoid any unnecessary attention, kept their heads low as they made their way through the streets, careful not to draw attention to themselves. They knew that they were walking a fine line, and one wrong move could spell disaster. Rollan's mind was racing, his heart heavy with fear for Aiko's safety. "We have to find her, Tom," he said, his voice pleading. "We can't let the police get to her first." Tom nodded, his face grim with determination. "We'll find her, Rollan," he said. A few streets away, Rollan and Tom finally caught sight of Aiko, hiding behind a storefront. Aiko saw them and ran towards Rollan, wrapping her arms around him in a tight embrace. "Rollan, my love," she said, relief flooding her voice. Rollan held her close, his heart finally calming after the terrifying ordeal. "Where are the androids?" he asked. "Didn't you follow them to Jericho?" Aiko shook her head. "No," she said. "When I realized that you weren't following me, I turned back to look for you. I couldn't just leave you behind." Rollan looked at Aiko, his expression softening. "Thank you, Aiko," he said. "But we have to find a way to get to Jericho. The police are going to be hunting for androids now, and we need to find a safe place." Aiko nodded. As Tom looked at Aiko, he couldn't help but feel a sense of disbelief at the transformation that had taken place in the short time since they last saw each other. Gone was the Cyberlife assistant uniform that Aiko had worn, replaced by a trendy outfit that made her look more human than ever. Her hair had been dyed a striking platinum blonde and cropped short, and her LED was nowhere to be seen. "Aiko," Tom said, his voice catching in his throat. "Is that really you?" Aiko smiled, her eyes filled with kindness. "It is, Tom," she said. "Rollan helped me change my appearance so that I would be less recognizable to the authorities." Tom looked at Rollan, his eyes filled with a newfound respect for his friend. "That was smart thinking, Rollan," he said. "If the police see an android that looks like Aiko, they'll know who to look for." Rollan nodded, his expression serious. "We have to do whatever we can to stay ahead of the authorities," he said. Aiko nodded, a determined look in her eyes. "Rollan, I asked one of the androids for the coordinates to Jericho, and they gave them to me through a data transfer." "Aiko, I don't think I can receive those coordinates like an android," Rollan said, his brow furrowed in thought. "I'm human, remember?" Aiko smiled, a hint of playfulness in her eyes. "Yes, I know, but I can still show you the coordinates on my phone," she said, pulling out her phone and displaying the location of Jericho on the screen. Rollan nodded, leaning in to study the coordinates. "Okay," he said. "We'll have to be careful, but if we can make it there, we might have a chance." Tom, seeing the coordinates on the phone, let out a low whistle. Jericho's outside the city, he said, and that's a long way to go, especially with the police on our tails. Rollan's eyes narrowed, his expression serious. Rollan, Aiko said, her tone firm but gentle. You don't have to come with me. You're human. You don't need to hide like I do. Rollan's eyes widened in surprise. Aiko? He started, but she cut him off. It's okay, she said, her expression unwavering. You and Tom should go somewhere safe. You don't need to risk your life for me. Rollan shook his head, his jaw set in determination. No, Aiko, he said, his voice low. We're in this together. If you're going to Jericho, then so am I. Tom took Rollan aside a few steps away from Aiko and spoke in a low voice, his gaze fixed on his friends. Rollan, don't risk your life for her, he said, his voice full of concern. Don't go to Jericho. I know you love her and she says she loves you too, but this isn't worth it. Rollan's eyes were filled with a mixture of love and confusion. What do you mean it's not worth it? He asked, his voice hushed. Aiko is in danger. I can't just leave her. Rollan, Tom said, his voice firm, you're not just risking your own life. You're risking mine too. If we get caught, we're done for. And for what? For a life with an android? Rollan winced at Tom's words, knowing that deep down his friend had a point. But even as he considered Tom's warning, Rollan couldn't help but feel a deep sense of loyalty and love for Aiko. She was more than just an android to him. She was his partner, his companion, and the one who had shown him that there was more to life than just survival. Rollan shook his head, his resolve strengthening. I'm sorry, Tom, he said, his voice low but determined. But I can't just abandon Aiko. She needs me, and I need her. I know it's dangerous, but I have to go to Jericho. I have to protect her. Tom looked at Rollan, his expression a mixture of frustration and admiration. He knew that his friend was stubborn, and once he had made up his mind, there was no changing it. All right, Rollan, he said, his voice resigned. But promise me you'll be careful. We're already in enough trouble as it is. We don't need to add to it. Rollan nodded, a grateful smile on his face. I promise, Tom, he said, and thanks for understanding. With that, Tom bid farewell to Rollan and Aiko, wishing them the best of luck as they made their way towards Rollan's car. Goodbye, Tom, Rollan said, a small smile on his face. Thanks for everything. Take care of yourself, Rollan, Tom replied, his voice heavy with emotion. And take care of her too. With that, Tom turned and disappeared into the bustling city, leaving Rollan and Aiko alone. They made their way towards Rollan's car, the only mode of transportation they had at their disposal. The city streets were bustling with activity, but Rollan and Aiko kept their heads down, hoping to blend in with the crowd. As they got into the car, Rollan turned to Aiko, a serious expression on his face. We have a long journey ahead of us, he said. Are you ready for this? I'm ready, she said. Let's go.